Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into some really interesting stuff today. We got a listener request to take a closer look at lab-grown meat.
Okay.
It seems like it's getting more attention every day. So yeah, we're going to dig into a blog post called The Alarming Rise of Lab-Grown Meat in American Restaurants
Interesting title.
from Pure Burger Bar. So that's kind of our jumping off point. What do you think?
Well, it's definitely a strong statement, and it reflects some of the anxieties people have about this new technology.
It does. And Pure Burger Bar, for those who don't know, they're all about that,
Right.
real food, grass-fed beef, bison burgers. So they're kind of coming at it from that perspective. But regardless, it's clear lab-grown meat is
Yeah,
making headlines.
it is. It's not science fiction anymore. Lab-grown meat, or cultivated meat as it's often called,
Right.
is already being served in some restaurants.
So just to level set, for anyone who's maybe hearing about this for the first time,
Sure.
what are we even talking about here?
We're talking about real meat, not plant-based substitutes, but instead of coming from an animal raised on a farm,
Okay.
it's grown from animal cells in a lab.
Okay, so that's where I start to get a little fuzzy. How does that even work?
So they take a small sample of cells from an animal
Mm-hmm.
and put them in a nutrient-rich environment, a kind of a special broth, if you will.
Like a petri dish, that kind of thing?
Similar concept, but on a larger scale. And this broth provides everything the cells need to grow and multiply.
So they're basically tricking the cells into thinking they're still in the animal.
In a way, yes. And as the cells multiply, they form muscle tissue, which is what we know as meat.
That's crazy. So from like a tiny sample of cells, you can basically grow an entire steak.
Theoretically, yes. The technology is still being refined, but the potential is there.
That is wild. And the article mentions, this isn't for a far off thing, they say lab-grown meat could be in grocery stores as early as 2026.
It is moving quickly. In fact, some companies have already gotten regulatory approval for their cultivated chicken products.
Oh, wow. Like already.
Yeah. Upside Foods and Good Meat, for example, they're serving their chicken in restaurants, mainly high-end places for now.
Wow. So it's already happening. But, Pure Burger Bar, they're all about that traditional meat experience.
Right.
They talk about their ass-fed beef and bison. And I think a lot of people hearing about lab-grown meat, their first question is going to be, okay, but how does it taste?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And the answer is a bit complicated. Some who've tried it say it's almost indistinguishable from conventional meat,
Really?
but others say there are subtle differences in texture or flavor.
I could see that. So, is it even possible to perfectly replicate the taste of a steak that came from a cow?
It's a huge scientific challenge. They're getting closer all the time,
Yeah.
but it comes down to things like the amino acid composition of the meat, how the fat is distributed,
So it's not as simple as just growing the cells. There's a lot of fine-tuning
a
involved.
lot of fine-tuning. They're constantly working on improving the taste and texture.
I read somewhere that sometimes lab-grown meat can have a kind of sweet or even bitter taste.
Yes, I've heard that too. It depends on the specific compounds produced during the cell growth process.
Interesting. It seems like you can find it more and more places too. The article mentioned restaurants in San Francisco, New York, Miami, but they also call this an alarming rise. And I think that's what we really need to unpack. What are they so worried about?
Yeah, they raise some legitimate concerns, primarily contamination risks, the use of genetic modification, and potential allergy issues.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. Contamination, what's the issue there?
So, because lab-grown meat doesn't have the natural immune system of an animal,
Right.
it's more susceptible to bacteria or fungi during the production process.
So even in a lab, there's a risk of it getting contaminated.
Yes, maintaining sterility throughout the entire process is incredibly difficult. Any contamination could make the meat unsafe to eat.
That makes sense. Pure Burger Bar is all about those naturally raised animals, and I guess they're saying those animals have better defenses against those kinds of things.
That's their argument. They believe the natural environment provides some level of protection that's hard to replicate in a lab.
Okay, so that's point one. What about genetic modification? That sounds a little scary.
I can see why people would be concerned. To make the cells grow faster, they often use what are called oncogenes.
Oncogenes, like cancer genes.
Well, the name can be a bit misleading. Oncogenes are naturally occurring genes that play a role in cell growth.
Oh, okay, so they're not adding something totally foreign to the meat.
Right. But there are questions about whether manipulating these genes could have unintended consequences.
Like, could it change the nutritional content in something?
Potentially. Or there could be other long-term effects that we don't fully understand yet.
Okay, for more research is needed there, for sure.
Definitely. We need to be cautious and make sure we fully understand the implications before this becomes widespread.
And the third concern they mentioned was allergies.
Right. Any new food comes with potential allergy concerns.
Makes sense.
And with lab-grown meat, you have the added complication of the growth mediums and additives used in the process.
So even if you're not allergic to meat itself, there could be something else in there that could cause a reaction.
Exactly. The FAO and WHO have identified a whole list of potential hazards with lab-grown meat.
And Pure Burger Bar, their focus on simple, real ingredients,
Right?
that's kind of their answer to that, right?
It is. They're emphasizing transparency and minimizing the use of artificial ingredients, which a lot of people find appealing.
I get that. So we've got these potential benefits, but also some serious concerns. It seems like a really tough call.
It is. It's not a simple issue. There's a lot to consider, and we're only just starting to understand the full implications of this technology.
Yeah, it's like, on the one hand, people are saying lab-grown meat could save the planet.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we've got these questions about safety and transparency and the long-term effects. It's a lot to process.
It is, and we haven't even touched on the environmental debate yet, which is a whole other can of worms.
Okay, well, we're going to need to open that can of worms then, because it seems like that's a key part of the whole discussion around lab-grown meat.
It is, and we'll dive into all that right after the break.
So before the break, we were talking about the environmental side of things, and that's a big part of why people are excited about lab-grown meat, right?
Yeah, the potential to reduce the environmental impact of meat production is a major selling point. Less land use, less water consumption, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional livestock farming.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, but I feel like there's always a but.
There is. It's more complicated than it seems on the surface. A study from UC Davis actually found that lab-grown meat production could lead to higher carbon emissions than some methods of raising beef.
Wait, really? So it might not be the environmental savior everyone's hoping for?
It really depends on a lot of factors. How the labs are powered, the efficiency of the production process, even how they dispose of waste products. It all adds up.
So it's not a simple equation. It's not just lab-grown good, traditional bad.
Exactly. We need to look at the entire life cycle of both approaches to really compare. And Pure Burger Bar, they're big proponents of what they call regenerative ranching as a sustainable alternative.
Yeah, they talk about that a lot. What does that even mean?
It's a way of managing livestock that focuses on improving soil health, things like rotational grazing, cover cropping, and minimizing the use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides.
So it's more about working with nature rather than trying to control everything.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. The argument is that well-managed grazing can actually benefit the environment by stimulating plant growth, sequestering carbon in the soil, and improving water infiltration.
Interesting. So Pure Burger Bar saying, hey, there's a better way to do traditional meat production.
That's their message. They believe that regenerative ranching is a more sustainable and ethical approach than both factory farming and lab-grown meat.
Okay, so we've talked about the science, the taste, the environmental impact. What about the legal side of all this? Is lab-grown meat even legal?
That's a great question, and it gets to one of the biggest challenges for this industry regulation. The current food safety laws were designed for traditional food production.
Right.
They don't really fit this new technology, so we're in a kind of a gray area right now.
So how do we know if it's safe to eat if there are no specific rules in place?
That's the debate that's happening right now. The FDA and the USDA are working on creating guidelines for lab-grown meat, but it's a slow process.
I bet. I mean, it's a whole new thing.
It is. And there's a lot to figure out: labeling, safety testing, what standards need to be met. Some states are even trying to ban the sale of lab-grown meat altogether.
Really? Why?
Some are concerned about safety. Others want more transparency about how it's produced. They don't want it to be marketed as meat if it didn't come from an animal.
That's interesting. It reminds me of the whole debate over plant-based milk.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. It's all about how we define these things, what words we use. Like the Pure Burger Bar article calls it lab-grown meat, but I've seen other places call it cultivated meat.
Is there a difference?
There is, and it's a deliberate choice. Cultivated meat sounds more appealing, right? Like something that's been carefully grown. Lab-grown meat kind of conjures up images of test tubes and scientists.
Yeah, it definitely has a different vibe. Like one sounds more natural, the other sounds more artificial.
Exactly, and that's all part of the strategy for the lab-grown meat industry. They want to shape the conversation and influence public perception.
So it's not just about the science, it's also about marketing and psychology.
Absolutely. The language we use shapes how we think about things, especially when it comes to food.
It makes you wonder how much of the resistance to lab-grown meat is actually about the taste or the safety, and how much of it is just about this idea that it's not natural.
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of cultural baggage around food, what we consider normal, what we consider acceptable, and lab-grown meat definitely challenges those norms.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different aspects here, but let's zoom out a little bit. What's the bigger picture here? What's the demand for meat looking like, and how does lab-grown meat fit into that?
Well, the demand for meat is only going up. The global population is growing, incomes are rising, and that means more people wanting to eat meat.
Okay, so we're going to need a lot more meat in the future.
Some estimates say we'll need to produce 70% more meat by 2050.
That's a lot of meat. And traditional livestock farming is already under a lot of pressure.
It is. There are concerns about its environmental impact, the ethical treatment of animals, and whether it can even keep up with demand. So that's where lab-grown meat comes in. It has the potential to be a much more efficient way to produce meat.
In what way?
Well, for one thing, it's much faster. They can grow lab-grown meat in a matter of days compared to the months or years it takes to raise livestock.
Wow, that's a huge difference. But what about the cost? Isn't lab-grown meat still super expensive?
But the cost has come down dramatically in recent years. We've seen a 99% reduction in production costs over the last decade.
Wow, 99%. That's insane. So it's getting closer to being affordable.
Yes, the gap between lab-grown meat and traditional meat is shrinking all the time.
The article mentions some projections about the alternative meat market. What are they saying?
The alternative protein market is booming. It's expected to be a $100 billion market by 2029. And lab-grown meat is projected to take a big bite out of that.
So it's not just a niche thing anymore. It's becoming mainstream.
It seems that way. But of course, consumer acceptance is a big factor.
Right. Will people actually want to eat lab-grown meat even if it tastes good and it's affordable?
That's the big question. It comes down to a lot of things. Taste, obviously, is important, but also safety concerns, perceptions of naturalness, ethical considerations, and how much people care about the environment.
Yeah, it's like a whole web of factors. In Pure Burger Bar, they're making a pretty strong case for sticking with traditional meat.
They are. But they also acknowledge that the food landscape is changing, and we need to find sustainable solutions.
So it's not necessarily an either-or situation.
I don't think so. I think the future of food is likely to be very diverse, with lots of different options to choose from, and lab-grown meat might be part of that mix.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the cusp of some big changes in how we produce and consume food.
It does, and it brings us some really interesting questions that go beyond just the technical aspects. How will lab-grown meat impact farmers and ranchers? Will it lead to greater food security or exacerbate inequalities?
Yeah.
And how will it change our relationship with meat, our connection to the natural world?
Those are big questions, and I think this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the complexity of this whole issue. It's not just about science. It's about culture, ethics, economics. It's about our values and our choices as consumers.
It is. And it's a conversation that we need to be having as a society. Because the decisions we make now about food will have a huge impact on the future.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways you want our listener to consider?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that this isn't a simple issue with a black and white answer.
Yeah, totally.
There's potential for lab-grown meat to be a real game changer,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also a lot of unknowns and challenges we need to address.
It's not like we can just say yes or no to this whole thing.
Exactly. It's about having those tough conversations, looking at the science and the ethics, and making informed decisions as a society.
And as individuals too, right? Like what we choose to buy and eat.
Absolutely, our choices as consumers have a huge impact.
Pure Burger Bar, they're obviously coming at this from a particular angle.
Right.
But even if you don't agree with everything they say, I think there is some valid points.
They do. It's about asking those questions, thinking critically about where our food comes from and what the implications are.
And not just accepting the hype or the fear-mongering.
Right. We need to look at all sides of the story.
I think one thing that's become clear to me through this deep dive is that the future of food is not going to be one size fits all.
I agree. I think we're moving towards a much more diverse food landscape.
With more options and more choices for consumers.
Exactly. Lab-grown meat might be part of that, but it's not the only solution.
We've got plant-based alternatives, new developments in traditional agriculture, personalized nutrition.
Right. It's an exciting time to be thinking about food.
It is, but it also feels like a really crucial time to be making conscious choices about what we eat.
I agree. Our food choices have ripple effects. They impact our health, the environment, animal welfare, the livelihoods of farmers and food producers.
It's all connected.
It is, and Pure Burger Bar's slogan, "Real Food Matters."
Yeah.
I think that really resonates whether you're talking about traditional meat or lab-grown meat or something else entirely.
It's about knowing what's in our food and making choices that align with our values.
Exactly. And as this technology continues to evolve, I think it's important for us to stay informed, to ask those tough questions, and to demand transparency from food producers.
And to advocate for a food system that we can all feel good about.
Absolutely well said.
This has been such a fascinating conversation.
It has.
I've learned so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to break all this down for us.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these deep dives.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
As we navigate the ever-changing world of food, let's remember to stay curious, stay informed, and make choices that support a healthier, more sustainable future for all.
You here.
Until next time.